Good morning, everyone. Congresswoman, that was a moving presentation, but the disadvantage that your presentation puts me in is that it's very difficult to match up to the level of performance that you just gave. But I'll try my best and maybe talk about the situation around the world, talk about a few jurisdictions in Asia, how they deal with LGBT rights, and what possibly may be a way forward for an organization like Asian Development Bank and other multilateral banks involved in development. Uh, okay, this is a map of the world, which I picked up from the ILGA website, and it shows there are three others which will follow. This map basically tells us the situation of situation in relation to criminalization of same-sex relationships around the world. Now, if you look at the map, and I request you to focus on the Asia-Pacific region. All the whites with no color means it is legal for people to have same-sex relationship. It's not criminalized. If you look at South Asia and some countries in Southeast Asia, the color basically shows that it is still in the law books as a crime, and the punishment for same-sex relationships could be, in some instances, as high as death penalty, and in some countries these are treated as petty crimes. But let me also explain, although in the law books it says it could be as high as death penalty, it does not necessarily mean that it gets exercised every time. But it is there in the law books, and criminalization of same-sex relationship is quite prevalent in the Asia-Pacific region. One interesting element to this is if you look at countries in South Asia, you see that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, they all have the same color. Because as far as criminalization of same-sex relationship goes, they all have their legal provision from the time when all of these countries were British colonies. And the laws since the 1860s have not been changed, or even if those laws have been changed, they have been modified, but the criminality still remains in the law books. The next map is about protection. Now, on this map, all the blues means there is employment protection law in that country. So all the countries shaded in blue, and that is basically, if you look at Southeast Asia, in the Asia-Pacific region, we're only looking at Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and a few other countries. And most of the members of the Asian Development Bank don't have protection when it comes to discrimination in employment on grounds of somebody being a sexual minority. The third one, this is about recognition of marriage, or almost similar recognition, marriage or marriage-like arrangements. So if it is shaded in green, that means marriage between people of same sex are recognized. Now there are caveats to that. For example, in America, there are a number of states that they recognize, so not the entire country has that recognition. If you look at Australia, there are states in Australia that recognize it as marriage, and other parts which don't recognize it as marriage. But basically, if we look at the Asia-Pacific region again, we see that a lot remains to be done. Now, that hopefully will change at least a little bit for the Philippines if that law gets through, Congresswoman. But as of now, that's what the map looks like. And if we merge those three together, this is what the world looks like from the perspective of LGBT rights protection. Greens are where the recognition is of marriage and similar arrangements. The maroon and shades of red are where it is criminal for same-sex relationships. And the yellow, which is China, Mongolia, parts of Central and West Asia, are places where it used to be criminal, is no longer criminal, or it was never criminal. So that's a snapshot of what the situation around the world is. Now, I'll talk in the next couple of slides, I'll talk about a couple of countries where there are some interesting legal provisions that may be of interest. Now, it's not possible for us to cover the entire region, but I'll try and see what we have in 2 or 3 different countries. India, there is this interesting debate about what is called the Section 377 provision under the Indian Penal Code, which has been ongoing for a while. The provision, as I mentioned earlier, comes from the 1860s when India was a British colony and the Indian Penal Code was introduced, and it has remained exactly the same since then. Obviously, it's not in the law books in England anymore. It's been out for a long time. And the provision that is still there is, this is a part of the entire provision, carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal, punished with imprisonment for up to life. That's the legal provision. It has remained in the law books. It has not been used on a very regular basis, but it is there. It was challenged by a number of LGBT NGOs. It went to the Delhi High Court, and in 2009, the Delhi High Court did what is called a limited interpretation of the provision and said, to the extent of a consensual relationship between 2 consenting adults in the privacy of their rooms, this provision is unconstitutional, and that's how it should be read. It cannot be read as criminalizing same-sex relationships. That was the outcome in 2009 from the High Court in Delhi. But then it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 2013, the Supreme Court said this provision in its entirety is constitutional, and if this provision is to be changed, it should not be through lawmaking by the judges, it should be through Parliament making change in the law. And that's where it currently stands. So at this point in time, same-sex relationship in India is criminal. Now, there is a curative petition, there is a kind of a review petition which is currently under consideration in the Supreme Court in India, and that may come out with a positive development on this. But as of now, that's where things stand. Excuse me. Indonesia, the Indonesian Penal Code does not prohibit same-sex relationship, so it's not criminalized in that respect. But there are stigmatizing regulations at the national level, and there's one that I'm presenting an extract from. It's from, if I remember correctly, from a health department regulation directive of some kind, where it says a healthy sexual life means a life free from sexual orientation, dysfunction, or deviance, and a life in accordance with ethics and morals. So the law does not criminalize it, but as far as practice is concerned, central government departments quite openly use the kind of language that I've just read out. And then there are, at the local level, at the province level, there are laws in Aceh and Sumatra that treat same-sex relationship as immoral, pretty much like several of the South Asian countries do. Then the next example is Nepal. While doing some reading for this presentation, I was pleasantly surprised to see what Nepal had achieved. As someone who used to practice there until about 10 years ago, I had somehow missed out on some of the developments that took place after I left Nepal. There's one particular case that went to the Supreme Court, brought by a gentleman called Sunil Babu Pant. He runs a gay rights NGO and used to be a member of the Constituent Assembly for about 4 years. And basically, this was a petition on behalf of several NGOs representing the LGBT community. The demand was recognize third sex, recognize gender identity, and please give us a law that prohibits all kinds of discrimination on the basis of your sexual orientation or sexual identity. The outcome was very positive. The Supreme Court did a very good comparative analysis of how things were in various jurisdictions, what the most recent developments in the jurisprudence was, and then said, I mean, if you go to Nepal now and you fill up a form, immigration form at the airport, the form actually gives you 3 boxes to choose from. and that's a development that happened in the last 3 or 4 years. There is a very explicit constitutional provision, because we finished drafting our constitution just about a year ago. There is a very explicit constitutional provision that says discrimination is prohibited if it is on the basis of sexual orientation. And in addition to that, there is a directive from the Supreme Court to the government, under which the court has directed the government to draft a law to recognize same-sex marriage. So on that third point, the court obviously could not have just said that we recognize same-sex marriage, because that probably would have been interpreted as an extreme judicial overreach. But there is an interesting parallel to the gender rights movement in Nepal, which happened in the 1990s. And there was a similar directive order by the Supreme Court in the 1990s that told the government to come up with laws to end all kinds of gender discriminations in the law books. Now, what happened after that was the activism persistently brought this to the attention of the government, continued with litigation and all kinds of social actions. And we have now reached a point where, barring nationality and a couple of other issues, most of the discriminations in the law books, as far as gender is concerned, has been resolved, has been refined. And something similar could probably happen in case of sexual minorities also, with the help of the judgment from the Supreme Court. So those are the three jurisdictions in the Asia Pacific. Now, where do the claims for the rights of equality come from? It's no different to the LGBT community. It's basically the same set of international human rights instruments that we are talking about, irrespective of what your sexual orientation is. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the General Assembly on 10th of December 1948, which is a few days from now. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which deals with most of the civil and political rights, and then the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ICCPR and ICESCR constitute what is referred to as the International Bill of Rights. And they have all the provisions of equality and non-discrimination, which have been interpreted to apply to everyone, irrespective of that person's sexual orientation. Now, the guiding principle of all of these international human rights instruments is prohibition of discrimination, and essentially all persons, irrespective of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, is entitled to the protection under the human rights law, and the recognition that non-discrimination is universally guaranteed. There is an obligation on the states to enact comprehensive legislation that prohibit discrimination and to take effective action. Like, there are instances of violence against people of of sexual minorities, hate-motivated crimes. The obligation of the states under all of these human rights instruments and the jurisprudence coming from the treaty bodies under the United Nations system is that there should be effective investigation and punishment to perpetrators to protect the right to life and security in person of every individual. There is also an obligation to prevent all kinds of torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment against sexual minorities, including forced examinations and sexual violence. There is an obligation to define torture as a crime and to set up a system for proper investigation and enforcement, and obviously to decriminalize homosexuality. Now, where does all of that take us? We have these set of international human rights instruments, jurisprudence coming out of the treaty bodies, to which most of our member countries have committed themselves to. We have instances of individual jurisdictions where all kinds of discriminations are still prevalent. And we saw the overall situation around the world and where the Asia-Pacific region stood. Now, there was a very powerful case on the economic cost attributable to discrimination from our keynote speaker this morning. So obviously there is a very strong business case to do away with all kinds of discriminations. Could it be a rights-based approach? The UN bodies typically take that approach. I'm not sure, personally speaking, that a development organization like ADB will want to take that approach necessarily. For various reasons, and one of those could be that if it is a rights-based argument, it could become political very quickly, and that may be something that development organizations may not want to take up. Possible way that that MDBs like Asian Development Bank could consider the rights of LGBT communities in the context of our projects is probably to take the approach that we have been taking for a number of other inclusiveness-related aspects of our development. On gender equality, on child labor, core labor standards, we typically have legal obligations on our member countries that borrow for projects from ADB to adhere to certain basic internationally accepted requirements. On gender, actually, we've achieved a lot. And perhaps an approach, a thinking could begin to see if we can take a similar approach to LGBT rights also. And I've just been told my time is up, but that was my last slide also. Thank you very much.